On the night of February 27, 1943, 9 men descended into a Norwegian gorge in the middle of a blizzard. They crossed a half-frozen river. They climbed a cliff German engineers had officially ruled impossible to scale in winter. Between them, they carried enough plastic explosive to level a heavily guarded factory, a factory ringed with machine gun nests, mines, and floodlights. When they were done, not a single shot had been fired. Not one man on either side was dead. Inside that factory sat the world's only industrial supply of a substance called heavy water. Nazi Germany's physicists needed it to build a nuclear reactor. Winston Churchill later called what happened that night a major event in the struggle for atomic power. The 9 men who pulled it off were never told exactly what they were stopping. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, looks and tastes almost exactly like ordinary water. Chemically, the difference is 1 extra neutron per hydrogen atom. Strategically, in 1943, that difference was almost everything. Physicists on both sides of the war believed heavy water could slow neutrons just enough to sustain a chain reaction in natural uranium, a path toward plutonium, and possibly a weapon. There was exactly 1 industrial plant on the planet producing it in usable quantities. Vemork, a hydroelectric complex clinging to a mountainside above the Norwegian town of Rjukan. If Germany controlled that plant and the Allies did nothing, no one in London could say with certainty where the German atomic program actually stood. That uncertainty, not a confirmed bomb, but the fear of one, is what set the next 2 years in motion. The plant itself had a strange origin. In the mid-1930s, chemist Leif Tronstad helped design Vemork's heavy water process, a byproduct of the fertilizer industry, extracted almost as an afterthought from a cascade of electrolysis cells. By the time Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, Vemork was already the only site on Earth producing it at industrial scale. The French got there first. Days before the invasion, French intelligence agents quietly removed Vemork's entire stock, 185 kilograms of heavy water, and shipped it out through Oslo, then Scotland, then France. Norsk Hydro's own director agreed to hand it over, reportedly calculating that if Germany won the war, he could always claim he'd been forced. By late 1941, Tronstad himself had escaped to Britain. He joined the Norwegian High Command in London and began arguing that Vemork needed to be destroyed before German production could accelerate. But London needed eyes inside the region first. In March 1942, a Norwegian engineer named Einar Skinnerland, who happened to have grown up working near the plant, was aboard a hijacked coastal steamer when it was diverted to Scotland. British intelligence debriefed him for 11 days, gave him a crash course in parachute training, and dropped him straight back onto the Hardangervidda before the end of the month. His cover story was almost absurdly simple. He told colleagues he had been on holiday. He walked back into his old job at Vemork, having just become the first Allied agent operating inside the region, and would go on to feed London a steady stream of detail on guard rotations and defenses for the next 2 years. The first attempt looked nothing like sabotage. In October 1942, 4 Norwegian commandos, Jens Anton Poulsen, Knut Haugland, Klaus Helberg, and Arne Kjelstrup, parachuted onto the Hardangervidda, the barren plateau above Vemork. Their job wasn't to blow anything up, it was to scout the terrain and prepare a landing site for a much larger British force following behind them. They landed roughly 15 kilometers off target. What followed was 2 weeks of hauling 300 kilograms of equipment across some of the harshest terrain in Europe, rationed to a quarter plate of food a day. By the time they finally radioed London on November 9th, they were already living on borrowed strength. They had no idea their support mission was about to become the only thing standing between the operation and total catastrophe. 9 days after that radio message, Hitler signed an order that would decide the fate of the next mission before it even began. Captured commandos, uniformed or not, were to be executed. Nobody planning the follow-up raid yet knew that order existed. On the night of November 19th, 2 British bombers took off towing gliders packed with Royal Engineers. 34 men headed for the same landing zone the Norwegians had scouted. Cloud cover and a failed radio guidance link doomed them almost immediately. One bomber slammed into a mountainside, killing its crew and the glider following it. A tow rope on the second aircraft snapped, forcing a crash landing of its own. The survivors were captured within hours. Under Hitler's new order, every one of them was eventually killed, some by lethal injection from a German doctor, the rest by firing squad weeks apart at 2 different sites. 41 men died without ever reaching Vemork, and buried in the glider's wreckage were maps. German intelligence recovered them and understood immediately what the British had actually been after. Vemork's defenses tightened overnight. Guards doubled. Mines went in. Floodlights went up. The Austrian troops guarding the plant were replaced with Germans considered more reliable. And the one approach nobody reinforced, a 200-meter ravine plunging down to a half-frozen river, stayed open because German engineers had concluded no one could use it, not in winter, not in darkness. They were about to find out how wrong that assumption was. This time, the operation would be entirely Norwegian. 6 commandos, led by 23-year-old Joachim Runeberg, the youngest man on the team, trained in Scotland using something no previous raid had ever had. Exact scale models of Vemork's interior, built from blueprints, smuggled out of the plant itself by its own production manager, Jomar Brun. Brun hadn't just handed over drawings. For months he had been quietly sabotaging his own factory from the inside, adding castor oil and cod liver oil to the electrolyte to make it foam and disrupt production, carefully enough not to be caught. Runeberg later said no operation launched from England in that period had ever had so much detail available to it before departure. His team rehearsed on that scale model until they could move through the real building blind. They were also the first team fully briefed on what had happened to the men of Freshmen. Every one of them knew that if captured, he could expect no mercy. They carried suicide capsules. Their instructor in Scotland called them one of the best groups he had ever trained. None of the 6 men had been told what heavy water actually was for. Runeberg said later that Tronstad never explained it. Only that the mission mattered enormously, and that if they pulled it off, Norway would remember it for 100 years. That was the entire briefing. In an operation built almost entirely on precise technical intelligence, the 6 men risking their lives were kept in the dark about the one fact that made the target worth dying for. There was also a political tension running underneath the mission that had nothing to do with Germany at all. Norway's exile government in London distrusted the resistance inside the country. The resistance distrusted the exiled Norwegian army. Norwegian SOE officers didn't fully trust their own British commanders. And a second disagreement was already forming, one that would resurface a year later. American planners increasingly favored simply bombing Vemork from the air, while Tronstad and the British argued that only a precision ground raid could destroy the plant without killing the townspeople living beneath it. On the night of February 16, 1943, 6 men parachuted onto the plateau, 50 kilometers off target. A blizzard pinned them down for days before they could even link up with the 4-man team still waiting from the earlier mission. When they finally did on February 23rd, they had barely 4 days to plan a raid German commanders considered physically impossible to carry out. They chose the ravine. On the night of February 27th, 9 men, 2 stayed behind on radio duty, descended into the gorge in gale-force wind, crossed the half-frozen Mona River, and climbed the far cliff by hand. At the perimeter fence, they split into 2 teams, 5 covering the approach, 4 moving to plant the charges. A padlock was broken. 2 men found a narrow cable tunnel Brune had described back in Scotland and crawled through it, straight into the one person they encountered all night. A Norwegian night watchman, unarmed, startled, and entirely cooperative. A third raider, unable to find the tunnel, smashed a window and climbed in instead, and very nearly didn't survive the entry. Inside, one of the demolition men swung his weapon toward the sound of breaking glass, finger already tightening on the trigger. He later admitted that if there had been a bullet in the chamber, he probably would have fired. There wasn't. The moment passed. They set 30-second fuses on the electrolysis cells, let the watchman step aside to retrieve his glasses, and lit them. The explosion destroyed 18 cells and roughly 500 kilograms of heavy water. And then came the strangest anticlimax of the entire war. An off-duty German guard, woken by the blast, opened a door, shone a flashlight across the building, and went back to bed. 5 of the raiders skied nearly 400 kilometers to neutral Sweden over 2 grueling weeks, still wearing the British uniforms they had used deliberately. A calculated piece of misdirection meant to make the raid look like a British military operation and shield local Norwegians from reprisal. It worked. German assessments concluded the attack was, in all likelihood, carried out by British forces. Klaus Hellberg's escape alone could fill its own film. Chased across the plateau by a German soldier in a running pistol duel, he fell off a cliff and broke his arm, then talked his way into treatment from a German army doctor by claiming he had been out searching for the very saboteurs he was. He briefly shared a hotel with Reichskommissar Josef Terboven without either man realizing it, then leapt from a moving prisoner transport bus amid exploding hand grenades to make his final escape. Roughly 3,000 German troops combed the plateau in the weeks that followed. They caught no one, though they came close in one particularly cruel way. Searching for Einar Skinnerland, the agent who had been feeding London intelligence for a year, German soldiers arrived at the home of his brother, Torstein, instead. Einar was out on the plateau. Torstein, who had also been quietly helping the resistance, was arrested in his place, closer to the operation's real center than the Germans ever realized. Even the German commander in Norway, Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, was reportedly stunned by what he found at the wrecked plant. Later said to have called it, by some accounts, the most splendid coup he had seen in the entire war. Here is where the story most people know usually ends. It is not where the real one does. Vemork was rebuilt and back in production within months. When British and American planners lost patience with the pace of sabotage, the U.S. Army Air Forces sent 161 heavy bombers over Vemork on November 16, 1943, dropping 711 bombs. At least 600 missed entirely. Roughly 18 struck the plant, not enough to destroy the reinforced concrete-shielded high-concentration cells. Around 22 Norwegian civilians died, several of them children, and 6 homes were destroyed. For a loss of only around 60 kilograms of heavy water, a small fraction of what 9 unarmed skiers had achieved without killing anyone at all. Leif Tronstad had warned against exactly this. He had argued for precision sabotage over bombing from the very start, partly out of concern for civilian lives, and, by his own private admission, partly out of concern that a mass bombing campaign might hand Norway's post-war heavy water industry to a British chemical conglomerate instead. Blood, he once wrote, was thicker even than heavy water. The bombing accomplished one thing the raid hadn't. It convinced German officials that Norwegian production was no longer worth defending. Berlin ordered what remained of the heavy water stock shipped home. That decision fell to the one trained commando still hiding in the region, Knut Haukelid, deputy leader of the original raid. Orders from London were blunt: destroy the shipment, whatever the cost. An insider at the plant delayed the loading by a single day, ensuring the shipment would cross Lake Tyn on a quieter Sunday. On the night of February 19, 1944, Haukelid and 3 companions boarded the ferry SF Hydro at its dock, talked their way past a single guard, and spent 2 hours wiring 8.4 kilograms of plastic explosive to the hull, positioned to sink the ferry over the lake's deepest point, but close enough to shore to give passengers a chance at rescue. The bomb went off the next morning. The ferry sank in minutes in water more than 400 meters deep. 18 people died, 14 Norwegians, 4 Germans, including a 4-year-old girl. Local farmers rowed out into the freezing lake to pull survivors from the water. There was no way to warn the passengers without exposing the plant. The heavy water was destroyed. So, permanently, was Germany's last practical route to producing it in any real quantity. Even that outcome carries an asterisk historians still argue over. Some of the barrels loaded onto the SF Hydro were reportedly only half full, which meant some floated rather than sank with the wreck, raising a question that lingered for 60 years. Had the raiders actually destroyed the real shipment, or a partial one? The answer came in 2005, when divers recovered barrel number 26 from the wreck itself. Laboratory analysis matched it to German production records. The cargo had been genuine. Whether every barrel aboard was concentrated enough to be weapons relevant is still debated, which may explain why the shipment, unlike the plant itself, had been so lightly guarded in the first place. And here is the fact that recasts everything that came before it. Germany's nuclear program was never close to a working reactor. Captured records, the Allied ALSO's intelligence mission, and secretly recorded conversations among German scientists held at Farm Hall after the war all point to the same conclusion. The German effort was underfunded, scattered across competing research groups, hampered by early miscalculations about how much material a reactor would actually need, and crippled by the flight of Jewish scientists the regime itself had driven into exile years earlier. Germany's most advanced experimental reactor never even achieved a self-sustaining chain reaction. The men who skied into that gorge, the airmen who died in the gliders, the villagers killed in the bombing, the passengers lost on the ferry, almost none of them, and almost no one directing them from London knew how far behind the Germans actually were. The sabotage campaign did not stop a Nazi atomic bomb that was coming. It denied material to a program that was already failing, at a moment when nobody on the Allied side could afford to simply assume that. A 2015 forensic study of a surviving cube of uranium from Germany's last experimental reactor, built at Hagerloch, estimated the Germans would have needed roughly 50% more uranium and heavy water than they ever assembled just to reach criticality, the minimum threshold for a working chain reaction. They never got close. When the German physicists interned together at Farm Hall after the war heard the news of Hiroshima on the radio, several of them reportedly refused at first to believe their own country could have fallen that far behind. Werner Heisenberg, the program's most celebrated scientist, needed days to accept that an atomic bomb had actually been built by someone else. Leif Tronstad, the man who had planned nearly all of it from a desk in London, finally got the field posting he had wanted throughout the war, parachuting back into Norway in late 1944 to help protect the country's infrastructure ahead of liberation. On March 11, 1945, less than 2 months before Germany's surrender in Norway, he was killed, not by German soldiers, by a Norwegian collaborator, Jens Anton Poulsen, the reindeer hunter whose Christmas Eve kill had once saved his starving team on the plateau, took over the mission Tronstad left behind. Nikolaus von Falkenhorst was tried at Brunswick in 1946 and sentenced to death, later commuted to 20 years. He was released in 1953. Knut Hoagland, the radio operator who had kept Vemork's intelligence flowing to London through an entire Arctic winter, later sailed across the Pacific aboard Thor Heyerdahl's raft Kon-Tiki. Knut Haukelid wrote the definitive first-hand memoir of the Sabotage campaign. Joachim Rönneberg, the last surviving Gunnerside raider, died in 2018 at the age of 99, having spent much of his later life insisting the story wasn't really about heroism at all. It was about preparation, teamwork, and luck. For decades, the room where the explosives were actually placed was believed lost. Torn down in 1977, its contents scattered. Then in the autumn of 2016, archaeologists began digging beneath the ruins of the old plant. On October 5, 2017, they found it. The heavy water cellar largely intact beneath the rubble. It reopened to the public as a museum in June 2022. Go there today, and you can stand in the exact space where 9 men set 30-second fuses in the dark, helped a frightened watchman find his glasses, and walked away without firing a single shot. They were never told what heavy water was actually for. They were told only that it mattered, and that if they succeeded, it would be remembered for 100 years. What they didn't know on that night in 1943 was that the bomb they were racing to prevent did not yet exist, and by every account uncovered since, might never have. What they knew was simpler than that. The fuse was lit, the building was dark, and somewhere behind them a guard had already gone back to bed.